And welcome back, UCF fans, to our ongoing series of previewing the 2024 football schedule and looking at every opponent. Today, we're focusing on the Brigham Young University Cougars. And to do so, we have enlisted the help of somebody who's covered the program for more than a quarter century, Darnell Dickson of the Daily Herald in Provo. Darnell, how are you?
You had to use quarter century, not 25 years. Quarter century sounds like way longer, doesn't it?
It gives you a little bit more panache, though, I think, doesn't it?
Okay. If you say so. Makes me feel old, that's all.
Well, a lot's changed since in that time. Of course, these two teams played in the Boca Raton Bowl not that long ago. So since then, Zach Wilson's been traded to Denver, and now these teams are in the same league. Provo, Utah, and Orlando, Florida, in the same conference together. What a time to be alive. Tell us about BYU's first go-around. They started 5-2 last year. Things were looking good. They beat Arkansas on the road. They were the first of the newcomers to get a win in the league. And then they really kind of the bottom fell out. So what were the major reasons why they lost their last 5 games? And is there any worry about carryover?
Well, the first thing we have to talk about is injuries were pretty significant on the defensive side, and that caused them some issues. Coming into this season, we were worried about depth on that program going into the Big 12 schedule, and that kind of proved true. They just didn't have the guys lined up behind. Also want to mention that going into the Big 12, BYU decided they wanted to bring in a lot of fresh talent. They brought in more than 60 new players when you take into account transfers, guys coming back from missions, high school recruits. And that took its toll, I think, as well in terms of getting together and getting things cohesive. So that kind of led to that downfall. And the last 2 games of the season against Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, I think we saw kind of the potential of what BYU could do. They should have beaten both of those teams, had a couple of bad breaks in them, but they were competitive, at least in those, and had a chance to win. So as far as carryover, I think that if there's carryover, it's from those final 2 games as opposed to the losing streak, because they feel like they found some things that worked, and they're bringing back. They only brought in less than 30 new players this year, taking into account all of those recruits and transfer portal and those kind of things. So they're running with the guys they brought with them, and they think they're going to be better. So I feel like that's kind of where they hang their hat on, is they had a great 2 final games, and they found some things that worked with those guys, and now they're going to be a year older.
Yeah, it's interesting too with BYU. They were a team that I thought was probably the best prepared to go into this, considering that they've been an independent. They've played so many Power 4 teams, and right out of the gate that looked to be the case. But as you mentioned, the depth of all those rosters were tested significantly. UCF had very similar issues. They lost their quarterback early and really never kind of got going. They lost their first 5 games in the league, and only took them until November to figure it out. I want to ask you about the quarterback situation with BYU. Jerry Bohannon comes in, a familiar name to UCF fans, considering he was at South Florida, just down the road. And Jake Retzlaff is there as well. Kind of give us a sense of if it's is this a wide open competition, or do they have kind of are they leaning a certain direction in that position battle?
Well, it is wide open, and it's interesting because when you go into a season where you don't have a returning starter necessarily, although Jake Retzlaff did start the last 4 games of the season because of injury, you think, well, maybe they don't have a lot of experience. Well, they've got 4 guys on their roster that have started collegiate games, and that's Gary Bohannon, Jake Retzlaff, McKay Hillstead, who just came over from Utah State in between spring and fall camp, and Trayson Bourget from Eastern Michigan, I think, one of the directional Michigans anyway. So all those guys have starting experience. It's really, in our mind, it's down to Retzlaff and Bohannon. Retzlaff had the edge coming out of spring ball because of his familiarity with the offense and running Aaron Roderick's system. Aaron Roderick did tell us that Jake did not throw an interception the entirety of spring camp. So, you take that for what it's worth. Gary Bohannon coming off the shoulder surgery, with learning new system and new teammates, new coaches. He looked okay, but I think most people thought, okay, Jake is the starter coming out of spring. Gary Bohannon's made up some ground in the summer. He's gotten healthier. He's really spinning the ball well, according to the people I've talked to in the player run workouts. He's a specimen, 6'3", 225. He's had success, won a Big 12 championship at Baylor. So I really think it's between those 2 guys. And I think, like I said, Gary made up a lot of ground in the summer. So for the first couple of weeks of camp, that's definitely going to be something that we're going to be asking the coaches about and the players about what's happening at that quarterback spot, how soon they'll make a decision. How coaches are cagey. Probably not until the week of is when they'll tell us. But those are the two guys that are going to be competing for that role. They're similar in that they're both kind of dual sport quarter or dual attack. They can both run, they can both throw. I think Jake may be a little more consistent in his throwing, a little more accurate, but Gary may be a little more explosive. So we'll kind of see how that plays out.
Yeah, it should be a fascinating storyline to watch as the camp progresses. And, another thing I want to ask about the offense is whether or not they've got enough explosiveness to really challenge other defenses. Last year, BYU averaged 3.5 yards a carry, 11.2 yards per reception. The leading rusher, LJ Martin's back. Leading receiver, Chase Roberts, is back. Do you think this team has enough or has added enough to really kind of put fear into opposing defenses?
Well, they didn't really go out and get a bunch of different new guys for the skill positions. Those are mainly the same cast. The big problem last year really was the offensive line. They just never meshed together. It's interesting because they had a third round NFL draft choice on the team last year in Kingsley Suamataia, but they just didn't ever seem to be able to get it together and be able to get a good push consistently. So BYU replaced the offensive line coach, brought in TJ Woods. They also brought in Kevin McBride to run the tight ends, and that could make a pretty big difference as well. Somebody that's experienced in the NFL and college and getting the tight ends involved. So really when you talk about, I think they have good enough skill position players to score and move the ball. The issue is going to be how the offensive line comes together under the new offensive line coach. And the coaches told us consistently through spring ball, the emphasis was really on the run game, getting the run game better, getting better in the trenches to be able to handle the defenses they faced in the Big 12. So that's what I would say when you take a look at the offense. It's going to go or it's not going to go depending on how well the offensive line comes together.
And maybe there's some carryover into this next question because, I want to ask about the third down struggles, both offensively and defensively. BYU was 128th in the country on third down offensively at converting only 28.5%. They were 116th defensively, converting at converting 45.1% of the time. Was there kind of a common thread among why they struggled so much on money downs? Was it the offensive line for the offensive portion, or what might have been kind of a series of things you've noticed throughout the year?
Yeah, offensively, it's a compounding problem. If you can't run the ball, you're going to face a lot more second, third, and longs, right? You're going to have 3rd and 9, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 10 if you can't run it. And BYU struggled to run the ball. So I think that offensively is what I would point to is why they struggled so much. They didn't really have the ability to pick up those 3rd and longs very consistently. And against good defense, you're not going to. Defensively, it was, again, I think the defensive line, they had some guys that were injured, and they weren't as effective stopping the run. So teams, I can point to the second half of the Kansas game, TCU. A lot of teams just ran on them. Texas ran on them to the point where, they're controlling the ball and you're not getting the ball back. So as far as defense is concerned, they do need to shore up their defensive line. They've tried. They brought in some junior college talents and to try to shore that up. So as far as third downs are concerned, yes, it was definitely a big problem last year. They've addressed it, they feel like, by bringing in a new offensive line coach to help that running game. And then they just hope that the second year in Jay Hill's defensive system will be better because guys will understand it better, know where they need to be, and they've improved their depth. So those are the key moments or key things they need to take care of in order to change that third down issue.
Kind of feels like a cliche when you say that, the struggles for a team on third down oftentimes stem from what happens on first down and second down. But, having watched UCF, they were very similar, where they would get, if they were in third and medium, it would be a lot more difficult to try to figure out what play was coming, and it opens the entire playbook up for opponents, right?
And I think what BYU faced, they've played an independent schedule, so they've played some power conference teams, but to play those guys consecutively, you see the difference between a really good power 4 or power conference team's defense that can put you in 3rd and 9 and just, strangle you. That happens more often than it does when you're playing an independent schedule. So they have to deal with that as well.
So let's move to a player that really thrived last year, arguably one of the I don't think arguably, but one of the bright spots for BYU, Tyler Batty on the defensive line. Comes into the year with 15 career sacks, 101 career pressures, was a preseason All Big 12 selection. What makes this guy so effective, and what do you think his chances are to be an NFL type of talent at the defensive end spot?
Well, I've known Tyler since his high school days. He played locally at a smaller school, but he was obviously very dominant at that point. What makes him effective is his motor. I think he plays hard every single down, and he's a really intelligent player and knows where he's supposed to be and how to get there. I've always kind of felt like he's underachieved, even based on what I know about him and what his abilities and skills are. I would like to see him get close to 10 sacks this year. If he does that, that means the defense is being way more aggressive and way more efficient, and that would lead him to having a big year in terms of getting in the backfield and pressuring the quarterback. That's really been an issue for BYU for the last 3 or 4 years. Even though they changed defensive coordinators last year and brought in Jay Hill, they still could not get to the quarterback. And some of that, again, going back to the first and second down thing, if you can force a 3rd and long, you're much better off guys pinning their ears back and trying to get to the quarterback than you are at 3rd and 2 or 3rd and 3, because they can just throw a quick pass and you're pretty much helpless to stop it. So is he an NFL guy? I'd say fringe at this point. I think he'd be a free agent unless he has a really big year, and then he might be a mid to late round draft choice. But he's definitely the most impactful player defensively they've got right now.
Cross light, who knows what the temperature is going to be like. I imagine it'll be warmer than what it'll be in Utah right around this time when these teams kick off. Sitting here at the end of July, what's kind of your pulse as to how this game may play out between these two teams?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit down the road. I know if I'm a coach, I'm saying I'm only concerned about the next opponent, right? That's kind of how they handle things. But BYU has a very difficult schedule when you take a look at who they end up playing in the Big 12. They have Kansas State. They got to play Arizona. They got Utah and Salt Lake, which is a revival of a very nice rivalry, a very fun and very intense rivalry that kind of lost some of its luster over the last dozen years as Utah went to the Pac-12. And they play, but not as consistently. So they haven't played since 2021, which was a BYU win. So the Cougars and the Cougar fans have been able to sit on that for 3 years that they won the last game. But Utah had won the 9 previous. So and that one's interesting to me because BYU, in those 9 games that Utah won, 7 of them were decided by single digits. So it wasn't like BYU was very far off in some of those. They just needed to make another play. And on an even playing field in terms of resources and money, they're getting closer to what Utah's been having in the Pac-12. So we'll see how that plays out. But I know UCF is talented. They've always got a lot of talent. BYU has played them a couple of times. Lost there in overtime, I believe. What was that, like 2019 or something like that?
Sure.
Way back then, yeah. And then you mentioned the Boca Raton Bowl. It's a long trip, and it's interesting for me because BYU last year put in 15,000 miles to play in the Big 12, and it was more than what they played in Independence, more than what they traveled. This year, it's more like 6,000 miles. I don't know if that makes a big difference, but that is a lot more travel that they had to take last year that they're not doing this year. To be honest with you, I haven't looked into every team yet that they're playing. I'm still kind of gathering that information, but I know UCF is always a talented team, and I look forward to that matchup because we'll know a lot more about both of those teams when we reach that point.
Yeah, I think that there's not that many players that really are going to have that sort of memory from that game against BYU. I mean, I remember Zach Wilson lit them up, and they're so pivotal for his draft stock to get catapult him to be the number 2 pick in the draft. With that said, I mean, I always think a team having to travel multiple time zones, especially in the middle of the season when, I always think that's challenging. And UCF, if things are going well, UCF's building can rock. If not, it can be a little bit of a sleepwalk, especially if it's an earlier kickoff. So, yeah, I think there's
Yeah, I was going to say Utah's picked to win the Big 12, but they're used to traveling an hour and a half on a flight to the West Coast for games. Right. And playing them late at night. And then they're going to be making some longer trips. That may make a difference in how, and they're going to places they haven't played in before, hostile environments and things like that. So I think it'll be a great league. I thought it was a great league last year. A lot of really good teams and fun places to go. And Oklahoma State ends up, beating BYU and getting to the conference championship game. And it was a good year. And I feel like BYU fans feel very fortunate to be in a power conference as things are still changing and adjusting and altering, and it's a much better position to be in than playing an independent schedule like they were.
Yeah, and there is no dominant brand. We've talked about that with a few of the other writers. There's no Texas and Oklahoma now, so year in, year out, you're not expecting that those one or two teams to kind of control the pulse of the league. Whereas now, the winner of the league gets an automatic trip to the playoff, and there's realistically, I'd say at least half a dozen teams, probably more, that are going to feel like they've got a shot at this thing by the time action kicks off in August. Darnell, where can people find you on social media, and where can people find your work?
Well, on X, I'm at Darnell Writes, and the Daily Herald website is heraldextra.com, so all the stories pop up on there. And you can also listen to the podcast of the ESPN960.com. That's where I do radio a couple times a week with former BYU player Ben Criddle. Lots of good BYU information on there as well.
Good deal. And for BYU fans tuning in, I'm at Chris Boyle, DBNJ. For the Daytona Beach News Journal, and news-journalonline.com is where you can find all of our preview content as we get ready for UCF football this season. Darnell, thanks so much for your time.
Absolutely, Chris. Have a good one.